Picture this. A breeze slipping past stone walls like it's trying not to be noticed. Torchlight dances on sand-covered floors, casting shadows that stretch a little too far. And somewhere beyond the silence, a soft, metallic clatter. Chains. Welcome to Capua, Rome's favorite little death boot camp, where men weren't just taught to fight. They were trained to die photogenically. Now, if you're picturing gladiators emerging to applause, abs glistening, trumpets blaring, calm down, Netflix. Tonight doesn't begin in a stadium. It begins in a whisper. In that strange, electric hush where fear starts to look a lot like freedom. The place before the story gets loud. You're probably in bed right now, dodging the chaos in your own head. So let me offer you someone else's noise. A man who didn't belong. Not in chains. Not under Rome. His name, and yes, it's real, was Spartacus. And no, this isn't the Hollywood version. There's less eyeliner and more existential dread. If this helps slow your thoughts, even just a little, great. Like, subscribe, or don't. Comment if you feel like it. Tell me where you're listening from, what time it is, how awake you still are. Because even when the world feels still, you're not the only one searching for quiet. But to understand who Spartacus was, not the polished myth, but the raw human, we need to scroll back. Before the swords, before the chants, before the legend, back when he was just another shadow in the firelight. Spartacus wasn't born a slave. He was born in Thrace, a rugged, no-nonsense region where the goats had attitude and the winters fought dirty. It was less a homeland and more a training montage. He learned early that life doesn't ask politely, it punches. He probably spent more time dodging wolves than reading poetry. At some point, Rome handed him a sword and said, "Fight for us." So he did. Until, inevitably, he didn't. Maybe he snapped. Maybe he saw through the hypocrisy. Maybe he just got tired of bleeding for people who called him savage. Rome, of course, responded with its usual diplomacy, shackles. One day a free man, the next day someone's receipt. Congrats, Spartacus. You've been downgraded to equipment. Not even top shelf, more like clearance aisle, gently used, barely rebellious. That's the thing with empires. They love you until you start asking questions. And then suddenly, it's off with your freedom and on with the chains. Rome didn't do passive-aggressive. It did aggressive-aggressive. And Spartacus? He just became another name on a long, well-organized list of problems they hoped would disappear. Spoiler, he didn't. The Ludus, where he ended up, wasn't a school. It was a pressure cooker with delusions of grandeur. It reeked of rust, sweat, and enough emotional baggage to fill a coliseum. Pain wasn't a side effect. It was the main course. Spartacus didn't arrive with a hero's welcome. He showed up as inventory, another spine to snap, another name tag no one would bother to learn. But somewhere between the chains and the stink of despair, something in him stayed sharp. He didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't try to be brave. He just watched, the way predators watch when they're pretending to be prey. While others flexed for attention or fought out of desperation, he memorized everything. The lazy guard who always scratched his chin at the same corner. The floorboard that whined like a gossip. The cook who drank more wine than he used in recipes. Nothing escaped him, because survival wasn't magic. It was math. Ruthless, calculated, emotionless math. Most tried brute force. Spartacus went with silence, the kind that slices deeper than screams. At first, no one noticed. Then they did. Not with praise, with paranoia. With stares that lasted a second too long. With whispers too quiet to quote. He didn't preach rebellion. He broke bread, nodded once, said less. But in a world designed to erase people, he became noticeable. That, in itself, was dangerous. Not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. He just endured. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Then came the fissure, not an explosion, but a crack in the monotony. A joke mid-drill. A sarcastic jab while chewing something that might have been food. What if we didn't die here? Most laughed because not laughing would mean admitting hope. A few didn't. And hope, like mold, spreads best in damp, quiet corners. It wasn't a rebellion yet. Just a murmur, a maybe, a mental post-it note. What if? When? Who's watching? Who's drunk? Spartacus didn't draw blueprints. He counted heartbeats, patrol gaps, guard yawns. He wasn't waiting for destiny. He was waiting for an opening. And eventually, like all bad plans destined to go viral, it showed up. A storm rolling in. A door left ajar. A guard thinking too hard about dinner. The universe didn't scream. It whispered, now. No swords. Just kitchen scraps, rusted metal, and weaponized rage. Not loud rage. Focused rage. Rage that had been aging in barrels for years. 70 men. 70 inconvenient ghosts who'd decided not to stay dead. The first guard went down like a whisper. The second like a warning shot. What followed wasn't strategy. It was combustion. A glorious, blood-soaked malfunction. The ludus went from obedience machine to funeral pyre in under 3 minutes. Spartacus didn't bark orders. He moved like someone who'd practiced this in nightmares. Not a leader. Not yet. Just a man who looked at his cage and said, no. They hit the armory. Finally, actual weapons. Not props. Not illusions. Tools made for theater, now repurposed for freedom. And when the gate cracked open, letting in the cool Roman air, it wasn't a movie moment. It was silence. Just them. Breathing. Still here. For a second, no one moved. Then they did. Not in neat rows. Not like soldiers. Like shadows fleeing a spotlight. Into the hills. The woods. The wild. Together. And that's how it began. No flag. No slogan. No grand speech. Just a kitchen knife. And a collective middle finger to the empire. They didn't wait for morning. Rebellions don't punch time cards. They slipped into the night. Messy, unscripted, improvised like jazz with daggers. It wasn't clean. It wasn't noble. But it worked. The first guard? Silent. The second? Dramatic. By the time the third figured it out, Spartacus and his crew had already raided the armory and armed themselves properly. Not just with weapons, with purpose. With momentum. With a very sharp grudge. It was chaos. Glorious, desperate chaos. Blood on the walls. Sand soaked in sweat. The kind of madness that smells like metal and fear and something else too. Something holy. They didn't kill for revenge. They fought to breathe. To step outside the walls not as prisoners, but as people again. And they did. Against all odds, they stormed out of that school and vanished into the countryside like ghosts. Slaves turned shadows. Shadows turned myth. Rome didn't see it coming. Why would it? The idea that a group of sweaty, underfed gladiators could outsmart their captors? Unthinkable. Laughable. Until, of course, it wasn't. Spartacus didn't celebrate. He didn't cheer. He just kept moving. The escape wasn't a victory, it was an opening. And he knew Rome wouldn't let it go unpunished. They weren't free yet. They were fugitives. And freedom, as it turns out, is a moving target, especially when you're being hunted by the largest empire in the known world. They headed for the hills. Found caves, forests, forgotten paths. Some stole food. Others scouted. A few couldn't handle it and simply disappeared into the dark. But the core group? They stuck together. Because now, they weren't just surviving. They were choosing each other. More slaves joined them. News spread like wildfire. Slaves had escaped. They fought back. They lived. And suddenly, Spartacus was no longer just a name. He was an idea. The idea that no chain was too thick. No empire too big. No slave too broken. And that was terrifying. Rome sent a small force to capture them. Just a few hundred soldiers. Nothing major. After all, these were escaped gladiators, not trained generals. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. The rebels, armed with stolen weapons and a sense of purpose sharp enough to cut steel, obliterated them. Rome didn't just lose the fight, it lost its illusion of control. That's when people started paying attention. Not just other slaves, but citizens, soldiers, politicians. Who was this man? This Thracian with no army, no resources, no royal blood, and yet somehow, winning? Spartacus didn't ask for followers. He didn't demand loyalty, but people came anyway. Because in a world where everyone had accepted the way things were, he was proof that the way things were could be changed. So no, the escape from Capua wasn't perfect. It was messy, brutal, improvised, but it worked. And like a match dropped in a dry field, it lit a fire Rome couldn't unsee. Freedom isn't peaceful. That's the first thing they learned. It's not soft, not polite, and definitely not quiet. It's messy, loud, disorganized, like trying to herd goats through a thunderstorm while blindfolded, with a sword, and maybe someone's on fire. That's what the days after the escape felt like. A glorious, chaotic mess. Spartacus and his band of ex-gladiators were no longer just men on the run. They were suddenly something else, leaders. Whether they wanted to be or not. Slaves started arriving. On foot, barefoot, wounded. Women, elders, farmers, former soldiers. People who had nothing in common except one thing. The idea that maybe, just maybe, this Thracian man could pull off the impossible. They brought stories, rumors, dreams. And they brought problems. Too many mouths to feed. Too few weapons. A rebellion that had begun as 70 desperate men was now hundreds, possibly thousands, depending on who was counting and how optimistic they felt that day. Spartacus didn't have a throne, or a flag, or a strategy manual. What he had was instinct, grit, and the rare ability to look another person in the eye and make them feel like they mattered. That alone was enough to keep the group moving. They slept in forests, in caves, under stars that didn't care who owned the land. The group was constantly on the move, part army, part refugee train, part very confused family reunion. There were arguments. Always. Should they run north? Stay south? Find a coastline? Attack a city? Avoid everything? One group wanted revenge. Another wanted safety. A few just wanted bread and to not be stabbed by Romans or by each other. Reasonable request. Honestly, Spartacus tried to keep the peace. He didn't bark orders. He asked questions. He listened. Sometimes he led from the front. Other times, he just sat by the fire and let the group breathe. That was the magic. He didn't force people to follow him. They chose to. But Rome wasn't ignoring them anymore. After their little "we beat your army" moment, things escalated. Rome sent more soldiers. Better ones. They expected the rebellion to scatter. Instead, it grew teeth. Spartacus began organizing training. Teaching farmers how to wield spears. Showing slaves how to march. They didn't have horses or gold or shiny armor. What they had was nothing to lose. and that's a surprisingly powerful military asset. The group started using terrain like a weapon. Ambushes, traps, guerrilla stunts that made Roman generals cry into their maps. Rome was used to fields and flags and formations. These rebels? They fought like they'd been raised by wolves who had read the art of war and said, too gentle. Weapons came from the bodies they left behind. Food came from quick raids and even quicker exits. And morale? It came from the delicious fact that every breath they took was a direct insult to the Roman Senate. But under all that grime and rage, something softer pulsed, a dream. Not of conquest. Spartacus didn't want to sit on Caesar's chair. He wanted distance. Space. To disappear beyond the Alps and let the empire rot alone. It was almost poetic. Almost. But poetic dreams don't feed hungry men or calm egos twice the size of their swords. Still, they moved. Not away from something, but toward something. Slowly, clumsily, like a prophecy written in mud. Rome, naturally, twitched. This wasn't a scuffle. It was a fracture. A crack in the shiny marble lie they'd been selling everyone. For every slave that joined Spartacus, 10 more whispered his name between chains and chores. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a possibility. And possibilities are terrifying, especially to control freaks in togas. It wasn't perfect. They bickered. Supplies dwindled. People backstabbed. But momentum is a stubborn beast. And when people limp forward together, even when everything hurts, they leave scars too deep for empires to ignore. Rome, humiliated and flustered, did what Rome does best, overreact. They sent soldiers. Not many. Just enough to send a message. You know, the usual know your place routine. Except Spartacus rewrote the message. With blood. And creativity. The rebels didn't just win. They embarrassed the world's most arrogant empire. Used fog like a cloak, hills like slingshots, and desperation like divine strategy. Rome brought scrolls. Spartacus brought fury. And he wasn't just swinging blades now. He was thinking, planning, commanding. Turns out, when gladiator school doesn't kill you, it makes you very, very good at reading people, and then breaking them. Towns started falling. Outposts collapsed. Roads that once screamed Roman order began whispering rebel victory. And still, Rome shrugged. Until they couldn't. The Senate finally UN-clenched and admitted this was a problem, capital P. So they dispatched consuls. 2 of them. The big dogs. The don't mess with me, I'm important types. You'd think, with their experience and armies and fancy boots, they'd squash a rebellion led by barefoot ex-slaves. Nope. Spartacus outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outplayed them both. He didn't just beat them, he humiliated them. Strategically, poetically, thoroughly. Twice. Suddenly, every senator in Rome started sweating through their expensive linens. It wasn't just the battlefield losses. It was the story shifting. Rome ruled through fear, image, control. And Spartacus had cracked that mirror. Merchants grew twitchy. Landowners got paranoid. Slaveholders locked their doors and stared a little too long at their servants. Because if Spartacus could win, maybe others could try. He became a legend before the ink was dry. They said he could vanish into smoke, tame wild beasts, read your mind. Some whispered he was blessed by gods. Others insisted he was one. But Spartacus didn't want worship. He wanted escape. With every victory, he moved his people north, toward the Alps, toward freedom. He could have marched on Rome. He had the momentum, the numbers, but he didn't want a throne made of ash. He wanted a life, a quiet life, far from chains, blood, and cheering crowds that loved you only until you fell. But not everyone agreed. Some of his commanders, like Crixus, wanted revenge. They wanted to turn around, head south, and burn every Roman estate they could find. Spartacus said no. They said maybe. That's when the unity started to fray. Just a little, but enough to make the next move more complicated. Still, the victories kept coming. Every new win attracted more fighters, more hope, more pressure. Rome was no longer just dealing with a military problem. It was facing an ideological infection, one that spread without armies, one that made people look around and ask, what if we're not powerless after all? For a while, it felt like anything was possible. Spartacus, the Thracian slave who had once slept on straw and dodged rotten fruit in the arena, was now directing military campaigns against one of the most powerful forces on Earth, and winning, which made one thing terrifyingly clear to the Roman elite. This man wasn't just fighting Rome. He was making Rome look foolish. Victory, as it turns out, doesn't always taste like glory. Sometimes it tastes like exhaustion, like silence after the cheering stops, like a heavy, invisible weight pressing against your back, asking a single question over and over again. Now what? That was the question Spartacus had to face as his army grew not only in size, but in complexity. What had started as a desperate brotherhood of gladiators had become something else entirely. A moving city of ex-slaves, rebels, farmers, fighters, and families, all walking side by side, but not always in the same direction. And with each passing mile, the cracks beneath their shared purpose started to show. Some, like Spartacus, still clung to the original vision. Cross the Alps, leave Italy behind, and disappear into freedom. But others wanted blood. They wanted vengeance. They wanted Rome to bleed as they had bled, not just in body, but in pride, in property, in power. Crixus, one of Spartacus's most trusted lieutenants, became the voice of that rage. He didn't want to run. He wanted to fight. For him, the rebellion wasn't a means of escape. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And Spartacus, though a brilliant leader, knew that unity isn't something you hold, it's something you maintain. And in that moment, he was starting to lose his grip. While the rebels argued over direction, Rome found its own. The Senate, humiliated and furious, turned to a man who wasn't known for kindness, but for efficiency. Marcus Licinius Crassus, rich, ruthless, and terribly practical, took command with the cold focus of someone who didn't care about speeches or symbols. He cared about results. To rebuild discipline in the Roman ranks, Crassus revived a punishment so brutal it had been buried in the past: decimation. Every 10th man in a failing unit was executed by his own comrades, not as punishment, but as a reminder. Loyalty, in Crassus's army, was not optional. Fear was the glue. Meanwhile, Spartacus made one last push toward the Alps, hoping to stick to the original plan. But morale was splintering. The mountains looked unforgiving. Winter was crawling in. Supplies were running thin. And rebellion, strange as it sounds, had become a kind of habit. Familiar. Chaotic, yes, but known. Some say Spartacus turned back because he had no choice. Others believe he never intended to leave. That after all he'd seen, all he'd endured, the thought of Rome standing untouched was simply too much to bear. Whatever the truth, the Alps were left behind, and the rebels turned south once again, walking not toward freedom, but into the tightening grip of the Roman machine. Crassus, patient and methodical, didn't charge in. He built traps, trenches, walls, not around cities, but around Spartacus himself. Bit by bit, he turned the countryside into a cage, one that didn't look like a prison until it was already closed. Inside that cage, the rebels felt the shift. What had once been a flame burning toward a future now flickered with uncertainty. Food grew scarce. Trust eroded. Some tried to flee. Others talked of surrender. And Spartacus, though still a giant in their eyes, was fighting on two fronts now, one against Rome, and one against the weariness inside his own army. He still tried. He planned escapes, broke sieges, fought off the tightening noose with everything he had. But Rome was no longer underestimating him. Crassus didn't seek glory. He sought finality, and he brought with him the full weight of a civilization determined to remind the world who was in charge. And so, the rebellion, once a wildfire impossible to contain, began to shrink. Not in spirit, perhaps, but in momentum. And in this kind of war, that's enough. Because when unity fractures, even the strongest cause begins to bleed from within. And Spartacus, who had once made Rome tremble with nothing but broken chains and sharpened kitchen tools, now stood surrounded, not by walls, but by the slow erosion of hope. The end didn't come all at once. It came like dusk, slow, creeping, quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in just before something breaks. Spartacus and his army, once a rising storm, now found themselves surrounded by walls that grew tighter with each sunrise. Not walls of stone, but of hunger, exhaustion, and inevitability. Crassus had played his hand carefully. He didn't charge. He contained. Like a hunter who knew his prey was most dangerous when cornered. He built fortifications, trenches, barriers, siege works, stretching across miles, boxing the rebels in like an infection to be starved out rather than cut. Inside the trap, Spartacus kept moving. He rallied his men, planned escapes, tested the edges. They broke through once, briefly, in a flurry of courage and desperation. But even then, the path forward narrowed, the options dwindled, and the price of every decision grew heavier. By now, the rebel army was no longer a single force. It was fragmented, fractured, not from cowardice, but from sheer fatigue. How long can you outrun an empire before the ground beneath your feet starts pulling you down? And yet, even with the siege pressing in, Spartacus never surrendered. He didn't plead, didn't negotiate. He knew what Rome did with those who defied it. There would be no mercy, no exile, only spectacle. In those final days, he wasn't a general anymore. He was a shepherd, walking among those who had followed him through the impossible, asking not for loyalty, but for courage one last time. His speeches weren't grand. They were quiet, real. He spoke not of victory, but of dignity. The final battle was as brutal as expected, not because it was glorious, but because it was necessary. There was no more running, no more strategy, just the roar of steel, the crush of bodies, the screams of those who had carried hope for far too long. Spartacus fought at the front. Of course he did. That's where he had always been, not behind a shield of men, but beside them. In the mud, in the chaos, in the blood. Some say he cut down dozens before falling. Others say he vanished in the frenzy, never to be found. His body was never recovered. And maybe that was exactly how it should be. Because how do you bury a man who had already become a legend? Rome, naturally, celebrated. Crassus had delivered what the Senate needed: control, order, the return of silence. But to make a point, to turn rebellion into a cautionary tale, he lined the Via Appia, the road between Capua and Rome, with 6,000 crucified slaves. Mile after mile of wooden crosses, bodies swaying in the wind, a warning carved in bone and agony, not just to rebels, but to dreamers, to anyone who might, one day, dare to ask the same question Spartacus had whispered so long ago. What if this ends? But here's the thing Rome never understood. You can kill a man. You can crucify 6,000. But you can't crucify an idea. Not forever. And so, even as the rebels died, their story lived. Not just in history books, but in campfire whispers, in secret songs, in the minds of those still chained. Spartacus had lost the war, but he'd cracked the illusion, shown the world that even the most powerful empire could bleed. He didn't become king, didn't raise a flag, didn't rewrite laws. What he did was far more dangerous. He reminded people that freedom was not a gift Rome could give. It was a thing you took, a thing you remembered, a thing you carried in your chest, even when your hands were bound. And in that, Spartacus won something greater than a battlefield. He won the future. The dust settled. The torches went out. And Rome, as it always did, moved on. Spartacus had no grave, no monument, no statue carved in marble to immortalize his face. For the empire, that was deliberate. A man like him didn't deserve memory. He deserved erasure. Silence. But silence is tricky. It doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes, silence is where stories grow loudest. For centuries, the name Spartacus was barely mentioned. Rome preferred its victories clean, its enemies forgotten. Yet in the shadows of history, his story lingered, whispered by poets, retold by dreamers, unearthed by those who saw in his defiance not failure, but proof. Proof that dignity isn't reserved for emperors. Proof that even the lowest can rise. Proof that courage can bloom in cages. In the ages that followed, others would find his name again. Revolutionaries, writers, filmmakers, teachers, children. They didn't need his exact words, or the color of his cloak, or the place where his bones might rest. They needed what he represented, a reminder that chains, no matter how tight, are never truly eternal. He became more than a man. He became a symbol, not polished or perfect, but powerful in his brokenness. His story, passed from mouth to mouth, became a mirror. Some saw bravery, others saw warning, a few saw themselves. And maybe that's the point, because in every era, in every land, there are those who feel trapped. Not in iron, but in systems, expectations, silence. And to them, Spartacus offers something no empire can crush. The feeling that you're not alone. You may never lead an army. You may never wield a sword or face a tyrant across a battlefield. But somewhere inside, there's still that quiet spark. The one that asks, even in the darkest hour, what if we don't die here? That question is the legacy. Not the battles. Not the blood. But the idea that change begins not with certainty, but with a decision. A whisper. A refusal. So tonight, as you lie still, listening to your own breathing, letting the noise of the day fade like smoke, remember this. There was once a man. No crown. No armor. No promise of tomorrow. Just a breath and a decision. A whisper against an empire. And somehow, that one word still echoes. Even here. Even now. And while Spartacus vanished into the mist of history, no tomb, no statue, no final resting place. Something curious happens when you follow those ancient roads a little further east, past the empire's forgotten outposts, beyond the beaten paths of Roman glory. You arrive at silence again. But this time, it's a different kind of silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of stone. Imagine a city hidden in the desert, carved, not built. A place where entire facades rise from cliffs as if grown from the earth itself. Where temples aren't assembled brick by brick, but unveiled from a single mountain face. A place born not from rebellion, but from vision. Tonight, let's keep walking. Past the battlegrounds. Past the empires. Past the noise. Let's step quietly into the canyon of rose-red stone, and rediscover Petra, the forgotten city that refused to disappear. Let's step quietly into the canyon of rose-red stone and rediscover Petra, the forgotten city that refused to disappear. At first, there's just stillness. Not silence, exactly. More like the smug hush of a place that knows it's more beautiful than you. You step forward, and the walls close in. Tall, dramatic, sandstone giants curling like their mid-opera performance. This is the Seek. It's not a road. It's an entrance with attitude. Your footsteps instinctively hush. Not because you're scared, but because the place clearly has main character energy and you don't want to interrupt. Light slices down in gold slivers, the rocks glinting in every shade of expensive. You're not just walking into a lost city. You're being allowed in, like a guest who didn't totally deserve the invite. And then, just when your eyes start adjusting to the theatrical gloom, there it is. The treasury, Al-Khazneh. And no, it's not a bank. It's the drama queen of carved facades. At first it peeks out like it's playing hard to get. Then suddenly, boom, you're face to face with a stone structure so extra it makes cathedrals feel underdressed. Columns? Check. Intricate carvings? Check. Vibe of eternal mystery? Oh, absolutely. No one talks. Not because they were told to shut up, but because the place looks like it'll call security if you breathe too loudly. Even the wind tiptoes. But Petra isn't just one show-off facade. Nope. It's a whole city. Tombs, temples, staircases going nowhere. An ancient real estate flex carved straight into the cliffs. It wasn't built. It was sculpted. With vision. And probably a little spite. The Nabateans, the desert's quiet overachievers, didn't fight the desert. They negotiated with it like seasoned diplomats. Rain? Rare. But when it came, they hoarded it like it was vintage wine. They carved aqueducts, hid cisterns underground, and basically invented the art of passive-aggressive water management. While other civilizations were yelling at the sky for help, Petra just leaned back and whispered, "We're good." You don't hear Petra's past. You feel it. In the stone. In the light. In the way every carved detail screams, "Look at me," but respectfully. It didn't need walls or armies. It had cliffs, shadows, and a good publicist, obscurity. So you keep walking. Past nameless facades. Empty doors. Stairs that go nowhere but feel like they're judging you. It's a city with secrets, not because it's hiding something, but because it enjoys the drama. Petra isn't a city. It's a statement. A poetic flex. It wasn't made to dominate. It was made to endure. Quietly. Elegantly. Infuriatingly. And no, it wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. Petra survived because the Nabateans were smarter than the terrain trying to kill them. They didn't see rock, they saw potential. They didn't see storms, they saw plumbing opportunities. They didn't see silence, they heard strategy. Rain here was basically a rumor, but when it showed up, they were ready. With channels, cisterns, and the ancient equivalent of, "We planned for this 6 months ago." While other cities prayed for mercy, Petra engineered it. Silently. Efficiently. No fuss. No hashtags. Oh, and trade? Yeah, they crushed that too. Spices, silk, incense. Petra was the quiet kid in class who ended up running the entire economy. They didn't conquer trade routes. They charmed them. No armies, just maps, brains, and suspiciously good hospitality. They didn't scream for attention. They built it into the rock and let time do the marketing. And the best part? They stayed humble. No gaudy monuments, no emperor selfies. Just temples and tombs sharing the same cliff, as if to say, "We come from dust, and we're staying stylish." That's Petra, a city that whispered where others shouted. that endured not through force, but finesse. A civilization that saw the desert not as an obstacle, but as an aesthetic challenge. So yeah, Petra didn't disappear. It just got tired of being impressive and decided to nap behind a canyon for a few centuries. And now you're here. Welcome back. The Nabateans weren't just architects. They were full-blown desert MacGyvers. Artists, engineers, visionaries, survivalists with a flair for drama. While most people saw a hellish wasteland and immediately panicked, the Nabateans squinted at the cliffs and went, "Yeah, we can work with that." Rain? Barely a concept. But on the rare occasion the sky decided to cry, they were ready with an entire passive-aggressive infrastructure. Carved channels? Check. Cisterns tucked discreetly underground like a doomsday prepper's dream? Double check. While other cities threw their hands up and hoped for divine intervention, Petra was down there quietly collecting droplets like they were vintage collectibles. And the water game was just the beginning. Petra wasn't just surviving. It was profiting. Sitting at the intersection of ancient trade routes like it owned the place. Which, to be fair, it kind of did. Incense, silk, spices, Petra didn't steal them. It just waved them in, offered some wine, and charged a premium. Their diplomacy was smoother than their sandstone. They didn't build an empire with blood. They built it with logistics. They didn't need war chariots. They had maps, and charm, and probably really persuasive tea. But don't confuse brilliance with arrogance. The Nabateans didn't plaster their names all over the place. No coin faces, no victory arches. Their flex was subtler, a perfectly balanced temple here, a carved tomb there. They knew the sandstone would do the talking. And let's be honest, it's still talking. Even the colors were extra. The cliffs changed shades like they were showing off. Crimson at sunrise, golden at noon, moody violet at dusk. Petra wasn't content with being stunning. It had to be cinematic. And walking through it feels less like sightseeing and more like stumbling into a sacred whisper. The scale messes with your head. The silence isn't empty, it's charged. The facades don't just stand. They watch. Petra didn't just want to last. It wanted to outlast. Because strength, here, didn't come from size. It came from subtlety. From understanding instead of overpowering. From carving, not crushing. From elegance, not ego. It's what makes Petra feel less like a ruin, and more like a mood. And the deeper you go, the more surreal it gets. Tombs pretending to be temples. Staircases daring you to climb nowhere. Stone that looks suspiciously like it might breathe if you stare too long. Petra doesn't hand you answers. It hands you questions. Wrapped in sandstone. That's the point. It doesn't want to be understood. It wants to be felt. Which, frankly, is the most Petra thing ever. Even the city's colors seem like they were chosen by a moody art director with a flair for drama. The rose-red cliffs don't just sit there looking pretty. They shift with the light like they're auditioning for a role. Crimson at dawn, gold at noon, violet by dusk. It's not just beautiful. It's borderline theatrical. As if Petra refuses to stay still, refuses to be categorized, refuses to be anyone's desktop wallpaper. You walk its paths and something weird happens. Reverence sneaks up on you. Not because someone told you to be impressed, but because the place has that rare, smug serenity of something that knows it's outlived every critic. It wasn't made for kings or conquerors. It was made for rhythm, for sun and shadow, for silence and stone. A hum under your feet that says, "Slow down. We were here first." Petra didn't blast its existence through history. It murmured. It adapted. It endured. And that, not war or wealth, is what made it powerful. Because in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by all that nothing, Petra didn't just survive, it thrived. Not by dominating the land, but by decoding it. And the deeper you go, the more reality starts to glitch. The cliffs get taller, the carvings more absurdly intricate, and suddenly you're wondering if you wandered into someone's fever dream, or maybe a divine prank carved into stone. Facades peer down at you like ancient paparazzi, some bold, some subtle, all unnervingly watchful. And you can't help but ask, who were these even for? Most people call them tombs, a word that usually signals dead things here. But honestly, no one's totally sure. The Nabateans didn't leave cheat sheets. No handy inscriptions. Just mystery layered on mystery. Shapes, shadows, and architectural side-eyes. Take the monastery, Uldair. It sits dramatically high above the city like it's trying to one-up the treasury. Nearly 50 meters tall and absolutely not trying to be subtle. Yet when you finally reach it, panting and probably questioning your life choices, it doesn't intimidate. It welcomes. Like a mountain decided to get poetic for once. And then there's the street of facades, a moody lineup of tall, narrow structures that scream ancient gravitas. Some eroded smooth like forgotten memories. Others still clinging to ornamental glory. Columns, arches, fragments of gods that time politely half erased. No grand palace. No jeweled thrones. Petra's sacred spaces are all carved into the bones of the earth. Intimate, shadowy, echoing. More library than throne room. More whisper than command. Even the amphitheater isn't dramatic in the usual way. No construction. No bricks. Just mountain. Bent into a shape that lets people gather and listen. Sound with seating. And here's the kicker. This wasn't Rome. This wasn't Greece. The Nabateans weren't doing fan art of Western civilization. They were crafting something original. Something fluid and organic. Something that didn't bother drawing a line between holy and geology. You can't even tell where the rock ends and the reverence begins. And that's not by accident. Here, the divine wasn't perched in the clouds. It was etched into the cliffside. In every curve, every shadow, every chisel mark. Sacredness wasn't above, it was within. That's why Petra still feels alive. It doesn't preach. It doesn't explain. It invites you to sit with it, to listen, to look longer, to ask questions without expecting answers. Because Petra doesn't want to be understood. It wants to be felt. It's a reminder that the sacred doesn't always wear crowns or call for attention. Sometimes, it hides behind silence, waiting for you to slow down and notice. If stone gave Petra its shape, water gave it life. The desert may look silent and lifeless, but the Nabateans saw through it. They didn't just survive in this arid canyon. They engineered it. Because Petra wasn't just a spiritual sanctuary, it was a miracle of water management. Imagine building a city where the rain barely falls, where rivers don't flow, and the sun punishes every exposed surface. Most would call it impossible. But the Nabateans saw opportunity in every drop. They studied the land. Read the curves of the rock like scripture. They learned how the seasonal rains moved, where the flash floods rushed, where the water pooled, where the desert whispered its hidden streams. And then, they began to guide it. Stone channels carved with precision. Covered pipes tucked beneath walkways. Cisterns that swallowed entire storms and saved their breath for the driest months. And through it all, Petra never looked like a machine. It flowed, like a living thing that had learned to breathe with the desert. Water that once vanished into the sand now danced through the city, flowing gently beneath its feet. Everywhere you look, there are signs of this silent genius. Troughs and aqueducts winding through rock. Storage tanks tucked behind facades. Hidden basins that, centuries later, still hold the memory of rain. And it wasn't just about drinking. Water meant agriculture, trade, baths, rituals. It meant flowers blooming where nothing should grow. It meant fruit in the market, color on the tables, life in the walls. It also meant power, because Petra didn't thrive by conquering others. It thrived because others came to it. Traders crossed entire continents to reach this place, not just for the incense or spices, but because Petra had something no one else did: stability in the middle of the chaos. Water wasn't just a resource, it was an invitation. And so, from the high cliffs down to the valley floor, Petra hummed with a quiet kind of abundance. Not wealth born of gold or conquest, but of listening, of responding to nature instead of fighting it. That's the brilliance of Petra. The Nabateans didn't try to dominate the land. They danced with it. They tuned their city to the rhythm of the rain and the silence of stone. Even today, if you close your eyes and lean close to the canyon walls, you might hear the echo of water long gone. Not a roar, just a whisper, a trickle, as if the rocks still remember the hands that shaped them and the rain that once ran through their veins. In Petra, water isn't seen, it's sensed, not just in the channels and cisterns, but in the very breath of the place, in its stillness, in its patience, in the quiet certainty that life can bloom anywhere. By day, Petra shimmered with dust and movement. By night, it pulsed with whispers, footsteps, and flickers of flame. This wasn't just a holy place carved into stone, it was a junction. A beating heart at the center of 1,000 ancient paths. Petra stood where worlds collided. From the south came the incense of Arabia, rich, sacred, wrapped in mystery. From the east, silks and spices traveled across desert and mountain. From the north and west came metals, wine, scrolls, and the hum of Roman ambition. And at the center, the Nabateans, not conquerors, not kings, but stewards of the trade winds. That's why Petra still feels alive. It doesn't preach. It doesn't hand out pamphlets. It just sits there, quiet, stone-faced, emotionally unavailable, daring you to get it. It wants you to shut up and feel something. Not scroll past. Not snap a selfie. Just feel. Because Petra isn't trying to be understood. It's not your therapist. It's a relic, a riddle, a rock-based spiritual enigma that just wants you to sit still for 5 seconds and maybe notice that divinity doesn't always come with a user manual. If stone gave Petra its curves, water gave it breath. Now, imagine building a city where rain is basically a rumor. No rivers, no lakes, just sun, endless, burning, skin-peeling sun. Most people would call that a deal-breaker. The Nabateans called it a design challenge. They read the land like it owed them secrets. They tracked rain the way romantics track exes, obsessively, hopefully, with a lot of emotional investment. They mapped every trickle, every puddle, every whisper of a flood. And then they did what no one else dared. They taught a desert how to hydrate. Stone-cut channels so elegant they could be runway models. Pipes tucked under footpaths like ancient plumbing ninjas. Cisterns that swallowed entire rainstorms and held them close, like emotional support reservoirs. And here's the kicker. Petra didn't look like an irrigation project. It looked alive. Water didn't just show up. It flowed. Through the city. Beneath it. Around it. Like the place had veins. You can still see it. Water systems hiding in plain sight. Troughs, tanks, whispering basins. Even now, they hum with the ghost of rainfall. They don't scream function. They murmur genius. But this wasn't just about staying hydrated. Water here meant agriculture, commerce, cleanliness, ceremony. It meant color in a place that should have been dust. It meant grapes and garlands and the miracle of not dying of thirst. And let's be honest, it meant power. Because while Rome was busy flexing with armies, Petra just sat there with full reservoirs and a smug grin. Traders came because Petra didn't just have goods. It had something rarer, stability. And in the chaos of the ancient world, that was worth more than gold. Water was Petra's flex. From the cliffs down to the valley floor, the city whispered abundance. Not loud, not flashy, just solid, built on observation, on respect for the land instead of domination. That's the quiet brilliance of it all. The Nabateans didn't conquer nature. They negotiated with it. And nature, impressed, gave in. Even today, lean close to the canyon walls and you might catch it. The memory of water. A murmur. A drip. As if the rock itself remembers being shaped by hands that didn't want to win, just to understand. In Petra, water isn't seen. It's sensed. Not just through the architecture, but in the air, the silence, the rhythm. The sense that life, real, breathing, blooming life, can show up where you least expect it. By day, Petra shimmered like a hallucination. By night, it pulsed, with footsteps, laughter, lantern light. It wasn't a city. It was a beat, a crossroad with a soul. This was where the world collided. Incense from the south, silks from the east, metals, myths, and Mediterranean drama from the north and west. And in the middle, the Nabateans. Not warlords, not kings, just master-level networkers with the best Airbnb in the Levant. They didn't build empires by sword. They built reputations, trade routes, trust, roads so perfectly laid, even future GPS systems would blush. Security didn't mean guards with spears. It meant being known, being fair, being the place travelers actually wanted to reach. Picture it. You've survived weeks in the desert. You smell like regret. Your camel hates you. Then, Petra. Water. Shade. Market stalls full of strange smells and stranger accents. You don't just stop. You exhale. You remember. That was the strategy. Petra didn't buy loyalty. It earned it. Silently. Seductively. Every item traded came with a story. Every deal was a little prayer. Camel bells, coin clinks, murmurs beneath desert stars, Petra's soundtrack. It wasn't just multicultural. It was multi-everything. Languages collided like spices in a stew. Greek, Aramaic, Arabic, Latin. A symphony of syllables scrawled across ledgers, whispered over wine, etched into stone. But beneath all that commerce was something warmer. Petra wasn't just a stop. It was a sanctuary, a deep breath before the next 1,000 miles. People didn't just pass through. They held onto it. If not with their hands, then with their words. Petra lingered. Like a smell. Like a memory. Like something beautiful you can't quite explain. It's tempting to think of ancient trade as ruthless, cutthroat. But Petra suggests something else. That exchange can be sacred. That trade can be a kind of trustful. That giving and receiving, done right, is a moment of shared humanity. That's Petra's real magic. It wasn't a city built to hoard. It was built to connect. Oceans to deserts. Mountains to markets. Strangers to each other. And even when the trade dried up, when the roads went quiet, Petra didn't vanish. It waited. Because not every city dies. Some just go quiet until someone listens again. Here, greatness didn't start with bricks. It started with wonder. Petra wasn't carved. It was conjured. The cliffs weren't obstacles. They were collaborators. The Nabateans didn't impose. They harmonized. Look around and you'll see it. Temples stitched into the mountains like divine graffiti. Facades rising like operatic sighs from the stone. Not ego. Reverence. And beneath those soaring faces, tombs, extravagant ones, sculpted with all the flair of royalty, for the dead. Yes, really. Most cities hide their dead. Petra gave them prime real estate. Every doorway leads to a name, a legacy, a whisper. Some were kings, others, just rich guys with good taste. And many, well, we'll never know. But all of them carved their existence into eternity. Death here wasn't final. It was curated. And the treasury? That insta-famous monument everyone wrongly assumes held gold? Probably a tomb. Or a temple. Or both. Or neither. Scholars still argue. Petra doesn't care. Because Petra was never one thing. It was a playlist. A mashup. Columns whispering Greece. Motifs hinting at Egypt. Geometry humming Mesopotamia. The Nabateans didn't just build, they sampled. And then made it art. It wasn't just architecture. It was a conversation. Between cultures. Between gods. Between the living and whatever comes next. And in the silence between those carved notes, you start to feel it. Petra doesn't ask for your attention. It steals it. No billboards. No velvet ropes. Just stone, shaped by patience and belief. Long after its rulers turned to dust and its gods packed up their altars, Petra stayed. A geometry of faith. In the middle of nowhere. And nowhere has never felt so full. Because Petra didn't fall with fire. It faded, with grace. Even the city's colors seem like they were chosen by a moody art director with a flair for drama. The rose-red cliffs don't just sit there looking pretty. They shift with the light like they're auditioning for a role. Crimson at dawn, gold at noon, violet by dusk. It's not just beautiful. It's borderline theatrical. As if Petra refuses to stay still, refuses to be categorized, refuses to be anyone's desktop wallpaper. You walk its paths and something weird happens. Reverence sneaks up on you. Not because someone told you to be impressed, but because the place has that rare, smug serenity of something that knows it's outlived every critic. It wasn't made for kings or conquerors. It was made for rhythm, for sun and shadow, for silence and stone. A hum under your feet that says, slow down. We were here first. Petra didn't blast its existence through history. It murmured. It adapted. It endured. And that, not war or wealth, is what made it powerful. Because in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by all that nothing, Petra didn't just survive, it thrived. Not by dominating the land, but by decoding it. And the deeper you go, the more reality starts to glitch. The cliffs get taller, the carvings more absurdly intricate, and suddenly you're wondering if you wandered into someone's fever dream, or maybe a divine prank carved into stone. Facades peer down at you like ancient paparazzi, some bold, some subtle, all unnervingly watchful. And you can't help but ask, who were these even for? Most people call them tombs, a word that usually signals dead things here. But honestly, no one's totally sure. The Nabateans didn't leave cheat sheets. No handy inscriptions. Just mystery layered on mystery. Shapes, shadows, and architectural side-eyes. Take the monastery, Uldair. It sits dramatically high above the city like it's trying to one-up the treasury. Nearly 50 meters tall and absolutely not trying to be subtle. Yet when you finally reach it, panting and probably questioning your life choices, it doesn't intimidate. It welcomes. Like a mountain decided to get poetic for once. And then there's the street of facades, a moody lineup of tall, narrow structures that scream ancient gravitas. Some eroded smooth like forgotten memories. Others still clinging to ornamental glory. Columns, arches, fragments of gods that time politely half erased. No grand palace. No jeweled thrones. Petra's sacred spaces are all carved into the bones of the earth, intimate, shadowy, echoing. More library than throne room, more whisper than command. Even the amphitheater isn't dramatic in the usual way. No construction, no bricks, just mountain, bent into a shape that lets people gather and listen. Sound with seating. And here's the kicker, this wasn't Rome. This wasn't Greece. The Nabateans weren't doing fan art of Western civilization. They were crafting something original, something fluid and organic, something that didn't bother drawing a line between holy and geology. You can't even tell where the rock ends and the reverence begins. And that's not by accident. Here, the divine wasn't perched in the clouds. It was etched into the cliffside, in every curve, every shadow, every chisel mark. Sacredness wasn't above, it was within. They didn't build empires of conquest. They built networks, trust, roots so well mapped they became legends. And they knew how to protect them, not just with guards, but with hospitality, with fairness, with reputation. In Petra, a traveler was seen, valued, and taxed, gently. Imagine arriving here after weeks across the desert. Sand in your teeth, salt on your lips, your caravan stretched thin from heat and exhaustion. And then, Petra, water, shelter, music, marketplaces alive with color and scent. You wouldn't just rest. You'd remember. And that was the point. Petra didn't need to fight for loyalty. It inspired it. Every good exchanged here carried a story. Every route passed down like a lullaby. The camel bells, the clink of coins, the murmur of deals made under the stars. They were the city's true music. It was a place where languages mingled, where traders prayed in different tongues, but dined beneath the same awnings. Greek, Aramaic, Arabic, Latin. You could find them all here, etched into stone, whispered over dates and wine, or scribbled on ledgers by lantern light. But beneath the commerce, there was something else. A feeling. That Petra was more than a pit stop. It was a sanctuary. A place where even the weary found rhythm, where the desert's cruelty paused, and human connection took over. People didn't just pass through Petra. They returned. Or if they didn't, they spoke of it. Like a dream that shimmered just out of reach. All rose-red walls and kindness disguised as trade. It's easy to think of ancient commerce as harsh, full of deception and survival. But Petra reminds us that trade, at its best, is a dance. A handshake between strangers. A story passed with every item exchanged. A silent agreement, I give, you give, and for a moment, we belong to the same world. That's the real genius of this city. It wasn't built just to endure the desert, but to connect deserts to oceans, valleys to mountains, strangers to each other. And long after the goods were spent, long after the last caravan faded into the horizon, Petra stayed. A crossroad that refused to vanish. Not all architecture begins with a hammer. In Petra, it began with awe. Here, stone wasn't merely a building material. It was a canvas, a scripture, a soul. The cliffs weren't obstacles. They were invitations. And the Nabateans? They didn't conquer the landscape. They listened to it. Look up, and you'll find temples carved into the cliffs, as if the heavens had been etched into the mountain by gods with steady hands. Massive facades, reaching skyward, not in pride, but in reverence. The kind that doesn't shout, but makes you whisper without knowing why. And below, cut into the very ribs of the rock, were tombs, not hidden, but grand, sculpted like palaces for the dead. It's strange, isn't it? A culture that carved monuments for those who'd already left. But maybe that's what made Petra so different. They didn't just bury bodies. They preserved memory. To walk through Petra's tombs is to walk through a city of echoes. Each doorway once guarded a name, a story, a family's legacy. Some belong to kings, others to merchants. And some are still unknown. But all of them whisper the same truth, that even in death, there is dignity. And in Petra, death wasn't an end. It was a continuation, a merging of stone and spirit. The treasury, that towering, iconic structure at the end of the Seek, isn't a treasury at all. At least, not in the way people think. Some say it was a tomb, others, a temple, a place of worship, a place of wonder. Maybe it was all of them, and maybe that's the secret. It wasn't a city with just one story. It held many, layered, complex, intertwined. Each column and carving tells a different tale. Greek flourishes, Egyptian symbols, Mesopotamian geometry. As if the Nabateans didn't just build a city, they curated a conversation. A conversation between civilizations, between the seen and the sacred. And in that silence, among the shadows and sunbursts, you start to feel it. That Petra wasn't meant to be rushed through or photographed and forgotten. It was meant to be experienced. With the soles of your feet, with the back of your neck, with the hush that falls over your voice when something ancient is watching. The architecture here doesn't demand your attention. It earns it. No banners, no crowns, just stone, shaped by wind, time, and the hands of those who believed beauty should be carved, not claimed. And long after the rulers vanished, after the scripts faded and the gods were replaced, Petra remained. A holy geometry in the middle of nowhere. And nowhere has never felt so sacred. Every great city has a moment when its voice begins to fade. For Petra, that moment didn't come with fire or war. It came with silence. There was no invasion, no final battle etched in history, just a slow, shifting, forgetting. Trade routes moved. Empires changed hands. The incense that once flowed through Petra's veins found new ports, new roads, new kingdoms. And Petra, once the queen of crossroads, was left behind. The desert doesn't scream. It whispers. And so Petra began to sleep. Its temples stood tall, but the footsteps grew fewer. Its markets emptied, its voices dimmed. One by one, the water channels dried, the caravans vanished, and the vibrant city of color and commerce began to dissolve into sand and memory. Nature reclaimed the silence first. Winds swept the streets clean. Dust veiled the faces of gods carved in stone. And yet, the city did not crumble. It waited. For centuries, travelers passed nearby, never knowing. Locals knew something sacred slept in the cliffs, but the world had forgotten. Petra became a rumor, a fable, a name without a place. Until one day, a man disguised as a pilgrim asked the right questions, followed the hidden paths, and stepped into the canyon. Johann Burckhardt, a Swiss explorer, became the first outsider in centuries to stand before the treasury and see not just a ruin, but a resurrection. He didn't shout his discovery. He couldn't. Too dangerous. Too delicate. Instead, he walked away quietly, like someone who had stumbled into a dream and didn't want to wake it. And Petra? It stayed silent. Not broken. Not bitter. Just patient. Because this city was never built for fame. It was built with intention, not ambition. It never begged to be remembered, only to be worthy of remembrance. That's the difference between ruins and legacies. Ruins decay. Legacies whisper. Even now, when you stand in Petra, when you press your hand against a wall carved 2,000 years ago, you don't feel absence. You feel presence. A stillness so profound, it feels alive. The kind of silence that listens back. The Nabateans are gone. Their scripts faded. their rituals forgotten. But their spirit, the soul that shaped this city from desert rock, remains. In every curve of stone, every worn step, every shadow that falls exactly where it did 1,000 years ago. Petra didn't vanish. It waited. And now that we've arrived, it invites us to listen. Because in this city of stone and silence, the past doesn't speak loudly. It breathes. Petra isn't just carved stone, it's carved intention. Stand before the monastery or the treasury, and don't just look. Listen. There's a rhythm in the proportions, a harmony in the way light falls, a stillness that feels like the moment before music begins. Because Petra wasn't built randomly. It was composed, like a song in stone. The Nabateans weren't just traders or engineers. They were observers of the invisible, of cycles, of symmetry, of sound. They understood something that many modern minds forget, that mathematics and music are siblings, that the universe itself hums with structure. So they built their temples not only to shelter, but to resonate. Step into the chamber of the treasury and feel how your breath bounces back to you, how even a whisper clings to the curve of the ceiling. This wasn't accident. It was design, a place tuned like an instrument, meant to carry voices upward, maybe to gods, maybe to memory. Look closer at the facades. You'll see repeated ratios, spirals hidden in the stonework, a sacred kind of balance. Not decorative, declarative. As if each column, each ledge, each stair was saying, "This is where the divine meets the real." There's something deeply human in that. The longing to make sense of chaos. To find pattern in sandstorms. To draw circles in the dust and call them sacred. And in Petra, the geometry is more than aesthetic, it's spiritual. Even the placement of tombs follows celestial logic. Alignments with solstices. Shadows that fall exactly where they should, exactly when they should. Time turned into architecture. It's easy to miss if you're rushing. But Petra doesn't ask you to rush. It invites you to stay, to sit in the quiet, to notice how the walls breathe with the sun, how the corners hold echoes, how even the silence feels structured. This is what makes Petra timeless. Not just its beauty, but its intention. It wasn't designed to impress. It was meant to belong, to the stars, to the stone, to the people who walked its paths long before our names were ever spoken. And in that belonging, we find something rare. A reminder that art doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it's carved slowly, to the rhythm of the earth, waiting for someone, like you, to notice. History often forgets women. Or worse, it silences them. In Petra, their names are mostly missing from the stones. Their voices weren't carved into walls, nor recorded in Roman scrolls. But if you walk slowly, if you listen between the lines of what is written, you begin to sense what was never said. Because Petra wasn't just a city of kings and priests. It was a city of mothers, of merchants, of midwives, of guardians of memory. We know the Nabateans valued women in ways many ancient cultures didn't. Inscriptions, though rare, sometimes name female citizens, not as property, but as participants. Some even owned land. Others were buried in tombs with honor, not obscurity. But what speaks even louder is the architecture. The homes built to shelter generations. The courtyards shaped for gathering. The tombs that suggest reverence, not just function. These weren't spaces designed for warlords or tyrants. They were designed for life, and women were the architects of that life, whether history acknowledged them or not. Close your eyes and picture it. A woman grinding herbs in the morning sun. Children chasing shadows along the blush-colored walls. Elders in the shade, telling stories that no empire could erase. None of their names survived, but their fingerprints did, in the smoothness of the steps, in the soot of old kitchens, in paths worn not by conquest, but by care. And perhaps the most sacred silence in Petra is the one that holds their memory. Because real power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet endurance of a woman who plants a garden in a place ruled by dust. Sometimes it's a hand on a child's shoulder while the world outside rages with kingdoms and collapse. Petra's women weren't queens draped in gold. They were rhythm keepers, nourishers, breath givers. They survived empire after empire, long after the statues cracked and the flags turned to sand. Maybe that's Petra's secret weapon. The loudest stories weren't shouted from towers. They were whispered in kitchens, sung to children, etched into daily life. So if you ever feel unseen, uncarved into the world's grand design, remember Petra. And remember this: the strongest voices aren't always the ones history records. Sometimes, they're the ones still echoing in stone. Petra doesn't end. You might reach the farthest tomb, stand on the highest cliff, think, that's it. But Petra isn't a place with edges. It's a breath, a presence, a memory that lingers long after your footprints fade. Because the second you turn your back to leave, it follows. Not like a ghost, but like a thought that won't sit still. The Nabateans may have vanished, but Petra didn't die. It morphed. It became a city that waits, that watches, that holds stories not in books, but in wind, in shadow, in the way stone bends the light. It doesn't need to speak, because it remembers. It remembers the sandals that wore down its thresholds, the water that once danced through its channels, the music that pulsed through its plazas, the prayers, whispered, shouted, wept, that rose from its heart like incense. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers you, because walking through Petra changes you, even if you don't notice at first. Something about its silence, its precision, the way beauty grows from erosion, the way survival wears elegance like an old robe. Long after empires collapsed, Petra stayed. Not because it was hidden, but because it belonged to the desert in a way no conqueror ever could. That's why it still stands. Not as a relic, but as a witness. A witness to the truth that endurance isn't always muscle. Sometimes, it's softness. Sometimes, it's carving instead of exploding. Listening instead of shouting. Leaving space for time to do what empires never could. Last. Petra teaches us that not all ruins are broken. Some are just waiting. So as you leave this story, maybe don't say goodbye. Say, until the next breath. Because Petra isn't a chapter in history. It's a road that never ends. And maybe, just maybe, if you close your eyes tonight and listen closely, you'll still hear the city breathing. So now, as the screen fades and the night wraps gently around your thoughts, let Petra stay with you. Not just as stone, not just as ruin, but as heartbeat, steady, eternal, reminding you that silence isn't emptiness, it's memory. But not all silences are sacred. Some aren't shaped by time, but by teeth grinding through hunger. Some don't echo in stone, they settle in the stomach. And while Petra still breathes beneath the sand, there are places where breath itself became a luxury. So let's turn the page. From deserts carved by wisdom, to fields drowned by rot. Let's leave behind the city that endured in silence, and step into a land where silence screamed louder than thunder. Because now, we go to Ireland. And in this story, the stones don't speak. The soil does. And what it says is famine. Picture this. It's Ireland, 1845. The rain isn't poetic. It's not that romantic drizzle you see in movies. It's the kind that soaks through wool, through skin, through hope. The kind that whispers, whatever you're planting, I'm killing it. You step into your field, expecting to pull up your daily salvation, the humble, glorious potato. But what you find isn't food. It's rot. A gray, black, sour mess that smells like betrayal and future funerals. Welcome to the beginning of the end. At first, they thought maybe it was just bad luck. A cursed batch. Too much rain. Not enough prayer. You know, the usual. But then it kept happening. Field after field. Village after village. A silent killer with no name, no face, and no mercy. And the worst part? The potatoes didn't even die dramatically. They just turned to mush. Soft. Slimy. Like hope left out in the rain. And here's the joke. Ireland wasn't starving because there was no food. There was food. Tons of it. Cattle. Grain. Butter. Bacon. All packed neatly and exported. Because while your children coughed into their ribs at night, wagons rolled out towards ships bound for England. Food was leaving the country faster than people. Capitalism, the famine edition. You might be wondering, why potatoes? Why not eat something else? Ah, my naive 21st century friend. Because that something else wasn't for you. It was for the landowners, the landlords, the empire. You, peasant, you got the scraps, the potatoes, the root of survival. Quite literally. So when the blight came, that fungal little assassin, it didn't just ruin dinner. It unraveled an entire society. Because when your economy is built on one crop, and that crop melts like overcooked porridge, well, things get biblical. And no, the government didn't rush to help. Unless you count writing long reports about how tragic everything was. And suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the Irish were being too dependent. That's right. The same folks who created the dependency had the nerve to critique it. Victim blaming, Victorian edition. People started to whisper about God's judgment. Because obviously, the solution to starvation is guilt. Some said it was punishment for rebellion. Others blamed the fairies. Yes, fairies. Because when science fails, folklore steps in with glitter and a shiv. And then there was the silence. Not poetic silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind of silence that settles into your bones when your stomach is empty and the fire's gone out and your neighbors have stopped singing. Because they're dead. Or gone. Or too tired to hum. That's how it began. Not with a bang. Not with a war. With potatoes quietly dissolving in the ground. And a government shrugging from across the sea. But don't worry. Things were about to get much worse. Let's talk about potatoes. Not fries. Not chips. Not the ones you mash at Thanksgiving while pretending to like your relatives. No, we're talking about the potato. The Irish one. The one that fed a nation. The one that betrayed it. But here's the plot twist no one told you in school. The Irish didn't fall in love with potatoes because they were trendy or gluten-free. They had no choice. Because most of the good land, you know, the fertile stuff, was owned by people who didn't even live there. Picture owning a house, but your neighbor from another country gets the living room, kitchen, and all the food. You get the broom closet. And a single seed. And that seed was a potato. Not because it was romantic. Because it was reliable. It grew anywhere. It filled stomachs. It didn't ask questions. In short, it was everything the British government wasn't. So entire families, sometimes entire villages, relied on it. Boil it. Bake it. Sleep next to it if it's cold enough. It was food, fuel, and faith rolled into one muddy tuber. But monoculture, that's a fancy word for putting all your eggs in one desperate, edible basket, has one tiny downside. When that one thing dies, everything dies. And oh, how the British loved this system. Not because they were fans of potatoes, but because it was efficient. Keep the Irish poor, desperate, dependent, but just fed enough to work the land they didn't own. It's the classic imperial diet, one serving of survival and a side of economic strangulation. And if they complained, well, they were lazy, undisciplined, too Catholic. Basically, they were poor, and that made them suspicious. It's funny how the empire always seemed shocked when people they starved got angry, like poking a starving dog and then acting offended when it bites your hand. And then, in 1845, the Blight arrived. Not with trumpets or banners, just quiet decay. One day, the potatoes looked fine. The next, they were black, stinking, and dissolving like dignity under empire. Suddenly, the Irish weren't just poor. They were doomed. Because when your only lifeline is a vegetable with stage 4 fungus, things go downhill fast. But here's the real kicker. Even after the Blight hit, food was still being grown in Ireland. Wheat, oats, beef, butter, enough to feed millions. It just wasn't for the Irish. It was exported, daily, under armed guard. Imagine watching a shipment of bread sail past while your child eats grass. Not metaphorically, literally. This wasn't famine. It was managed starvation. It was economic policy with a body count. And London? They called it market forces. Because when poor people die, it's a tragedy. But when they die quietly and cheaply, it's a policy win. Even the relief was insulting. Soup kitchens that ran out of soup. Workhouses that made prisons look cozy. Projects that made starving people build roads that led nowhere, just to prove they deserved to live. Because heaven forbid you receive help without breaking your spine in return. So yes, the Irish were dependent. But not because they chose it. Because the system was designed that way. A rigged game. And when the potato failed, so did the illusion of mercy. It wasn't just the soil that went sour. It was the soul of a nation. And the world watched as it shrank, bite by bite, into silence. It started with a smell. Not the good kind. Not fresh-baked bread or your grandma's stew. No, this was more like wet socks, disappointment, and fun-gal ambition. At first, no one panicked. Because when you live in a thatched hut with 12 people and a goat named Kevin, you get used to weird smells. But then the plants began to look wrong. Not just a little sick. We're talking full Shakespearean tragedy. Blackened leaves, collapsing stalks, the smell of decay thick enough to chew. Enter Phytophthora infestans, or as history remembers it, the blight. A microscopic fungal parasite that had one hobby, destroying potatoes. Fast. It didn't march into Ireland with flags. It floated in, casually, quietly, probably on a breeze. Like death in disguise. No warning. Just surprise. Hope you weren't depending on this crop to not die. And the speed? Alarming. A field could look green and lush on Monday. By Friday, it looked like someone had set it on fire, stomped on it, and sprinkled it with despair. The potato wasn't just unusable. It was inedible. Soft, black, oozing, and toxic. Basically, the goth cousin of what you used to call dinner. People tried everything. They replanted, prayed, begged. Some blamed bad air. Others blamed witches, Englishmen, or that one cousin who never went to church. Spoiler, he didn't cause it. He just had commitment issues. Meanwhile, the British government offered advice like, grow other things. Sure, Nigel. Grow what? With what land? And how, exactly, do you teach starving children to do crop rotation? There were scientific theories, too. Some accurate. Most not. One newspaper even said the blight came from lightning fog. which honestly sounds like a metal band. But no, it was just fungus. Hungry, heartless fungus. The irony? This killer didn't bleed, didn't speak, didn't even notice what it was doing. It just spread. Like empire. Like silence. And people kept planting. Because what else could they do? Some dug up the same field 3, 4 times, hoping for a miracle. All they found was rot. And grief. Children went to bed dreaming of potatoes. Not luxuries. Not sugar. Not even meat. Just a warm, real, solid potato. A thing that once grew beneath their feet, and now crumbled in their hands. And still, the ships kept leaving. Full of grain. Full of livestock. While the fungus stayed behind, to finish the job. You want a villain? Sure. Blame the blight. But don't forget the policies. The landlords. The distant men in powdered wigs who decided famine looked fine on paper. Because Phytophthora infestans didn't create inequality. It just exposed it. The blight killed the crops. But the system? It killed everything else. Let's talk about abundance. Because during the Great Irish Famine, there was a lot of it. No, seriously. The fields? Full of oats and barley. The pastures? Covered in cattle. The barns? Stacked with butter, bacon, grain. The ships? Oh, they were busy, sailing daily to England, their bellies fat with Irish food. Meanwhile, the Irish? Not so fat. Mostly dead. Or dying. Or chewing on boiled grass and calling it soup. But hey, the economy was stable. Priorities. This wasn't a famine in the traditional sense. This wasn't nature being cruel and everyone suffering together. This was selective starvation. A kind of hunger curated by spreadsheet. Because while peasants buried children who starved on dirt floors, export records soared. In fact, Ireland exported more food during the famine than ever before. Let that marinate. The phrase "let the meat cake" suddenly feels generous. At least cake sounds edible. The Irish were offered sermons, workhouses, and silence. And yet, some in London insisted, there's no famine. They just aren't working hard enough. Yes, because laziness is what happens when your teeth fall out from malnutrition. The solution? Build roads. To nowhere. Literally. The government created relief projects, where starving men were paid a few pence a day to move rocks from one side of a hill to the other, and then back again. No purpose. No destination. Just suffering, on schedule. You want food? Earn it. Never mind that you've already given your harvest, your rent, and your last goat to the landlord. Work harder. Starve quieter. And the workhouses? Ah yes, the 19th century equivalent of a factory reset. Families separated. Dignity removed. Wages. Despair. Imagine being so hungry you beg to be let into a place where disease, abuse, and death are part of the onboarding process. And still, it's better than outside. Meanwhile, the food kept moving. Wheat rolled out in barrels. Beef in salted slabs. Butter sealed tight for export. The Irish watched wagons go by, sometimes escorted by armed guards, just in case someone got the crazy idea to steal back the food they grew. So yes, the famine killed. But the food? It lived a long, healthy life. Abroad. It fed London's tea rooms. It filled English markets. It sustained empires. And it left behind a ghost country, hungry, skeletal, silent. This wasn't scarcity. This was policy. And it worked. The problem? The problem was the people. And starvation is cheaper than bullets. So the next time someone says they just didn't plan well, or it was a natural disaster, tell them about the full barns, the heavy ships, and the sound of a child crying as bread passed by on horseback. This wasn't the failure of potatoes. It was the triumph of indifference. Hunger doesn't knock. It seeps. Slowly, quietly, like fog under the door, until one day, it's not just in your house. It's in your bones. At first, it's just the absence of a meal. A missed breakfast. A skipped dinner. Annoying. Uncomfortable. But manageable. Then it stays. And you start to forget what full feels like. Your stomach stops growling. Not because it's satisfied, but because it's given up. And that's when hunger stops being physical and starts becoming something else. A mood, a voice, a second skin. And when everyone around you is starving too, silence becomes contagious. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that hovers. Thick, heavy, like the air is chewing you. Your neighbors don't talk anymore. They don't sing. They just sit, stare, wait. A mother wraps her child tighter, not to comfort, but to keep them warm enough to last the night. A man buries his fifth relative in the same week and doesn't cry. Not because he's strong, but because crying burns calories. And let's not romanticize it. People didn't grow stronger through suffering. They broke, quietly, sometimes loudly, sometimes with teeth sunk into bark or leather or whatever might pretend to be food. There are stories of people eating rats, of people eating grass, of people eating people. We don't tell those ones often. They're inconvenient. They ruin the neatness of resilient spirit narratives. But they happened. And not because people were monsters. Because they were human. The kind of human who begged the sky to rain mercy instead of mildew. The kind who whispered to empty pots. The kind who prayed not for salvation, but for quiet death. And death came, not as a soldier, not as a king, but as a cough that never stopped. As a child who stopped asking questions. As a man who lay down in the dirt and didn't get back up. You want to know what hunger does to a soul? It shrinks it, turns dreams into measurements. How much food is this worth? Turns names into numbers. How many mouths can we afford today? Turns love into logistics. Do I share this crust of bread, or do I survive one more day? The church preached that suffering purified, that hunger made you holy. Funny how no one ever told that to the landlords, or to the pigs eating better than the priests. But people still clung to something. Some didn't even know what. Faith? Hope? The fantasy that maybe, next season, a potato might survive? Because that's what hunger does. It makes you desperate, but also impossible to kill. And that's the tragedy. Not that they died, but that they lived through it, and had to carry that emptiness in their blood, their stories, their lullabies. Some people inherit wealth. Others inherit trauma. And in Ireland, the soil still remembers. Eventually, some people stopped waiting for the rain to stop, for the crops to grow, for help to arrive, because none of it was coming. So they left. Not because they wanted to, but because staying meant slow death, and leaving meant a slightly faster one. Enter the coffin ships. Yes, that's what they were called. Not officially, of course. The ads said things like passage to the new world and fresh opportunity across the sea. Cute. But once you stepped aboard, you realized the only thing fresh was the smell of vomit, sewage, and existential dread. These ships weren't made for people. They were made for profit. And the Irish were the cargo, crammed below deck in spaces tighter than a politician's conscience. No ventilation, no sanitation, no dignity. You got a bunk, if you were lucky. If not, you slept sitting, or standing, or not at all. The trip to America or Canada, usually 6 to 12 weeks, unless weather, plague, or poor planning said otherwise. And surprise, poor planning always said otherwise. Food? Rationed, spoiled, or just not there. Water? Sometimes clean, usually not. Always warm, because nothing says luxury travel like sipping hot bacteria tea in a floating death box. And disease? Oh, the diseases loved those ships. Cholera, typhus, dysentery. It was like a cruise ship, but instead of entertainment, you got fever and hallucinations. Some families boarded together. Some made it to land without half their members. Some were buried at sea, wrapped in cloth, dropped overboard with prayers that sounded more like apologies. You'd think arriving in the new world would feel like salvation, but it was more like exhaustion with a side of suspicion. In Boston, signs read "No Irish need apply." In New York, you were welcomed with side eyes and slurs. In Canada, they put you in quarantine, sometimes for weeks, as if starvation was contagious. You left famine and found prejudice. You escaped hunger and landed in hatred. And still, you stayed. Because despite it all, the rats, the sickness, the rejection, this new place still offered something Ireland couldn't. A chance. Not a big one, not a pretty one, but a chance. To work, to eat, to exist without begging a landlord or burying your children in shallow graves. So you took it. You took whatever job they threw at you. Built railroads, dug ditches, carried bricks, anything that paid, even if it barely paid at all. And you sent money home, because someone always stayed behind. Too old, too weak, too loyal. You wrote letters, sometimes hopeful, sometimes false, because nobody writes, "Dear Mother, I'm still starving, just in a different country now." No, you say, "We're surviving. It's hard, but we're surviving." Even if "we" now means just you. And surviving means not dying today. The coffin ships didn't just carry bodies. They carried stories, surnames, ghosts, and on stormy nights, when the waves hit just right, maybe you can still hear them, not screaming, but whispering. We left because there was no room to die at home. Imagine writing a letter with hands that once dug graves. Not for money, not for pity, but to remember. That's what many of the Irish did. Those who crossed the sea, the not quite dead, not yet safe. They wrote letters scratched into cheap paper, stained with salt and sweat. Sometimes mailed, sometimes never sent, because stamps cost more than silence. But when they did arrive, they carried more than news. They carried witness, testimony, breadcrumbs from people trying not to vanish. We are alive. We think of home every day. The baby coughs, but she still smiles. And between the lines, we made it out, but we left ourselves behind. These weren't love letters. They were survival reports. And here's the twist. Most didn't ask for help. They didn't say, "Send money." They said, "Don't forget." Because what's worse than starving is starving quietly. What's worse than exile is being erased. You'd think after everything, the blight, the boats, the graves, they'd want to forget. But no, they held on. To names, to songs, to grief, wrapped in linen and prayer. Some wrote about how green the new land was, but how it didn't smell right. Some wrote about jobs, but how their boss spat when they spoke. Some wrote lies, not because they wanted to deceive, but because admitting you're still hungry feels like failure all over again. So they wrote what they wished was true. And the families back home? They read those letters like scripture, passed them around, read them by firelight, lips moving silently, like maybe, just maybe, saying the words could bring someone home. But home wasn't home anymore. It was bones. Empty cottages. Ghost fields where children used to laugh before their names were buried with them. Some letters became heirlooms, folded and refolded until the paper tore at the creases. Because when you lose everything, a sentence becomes shelter. And now, centuries later, those scraps of ink and desperation, they sit in museum cases, behind glass, under labels like Emigrant Letter, 1848. As if grief needs a date. They don't read like history, they read like breath, like someone whispering across time. We were here, we lived, we tried. And honestly, that's what they wanted more than anything. Not sympathy, not statistics, just memory. Because empires build monuments to power. But the powerless? They write letters. Walk through Ireland today, and you'll see green. So much green it almost hurts. Postcard green. Tourism brochure green. The kind of green that says, all is well here. But look closer. Beneath the moss. Between the stones. In the silence between raindrops. That's where the famine still lives. Not in drama. Not in ruins. But in the spaces where people used to be. An abandoned cottage. Half a stone wall. A crumbled hearth surrounded by nettles. No sign. No plaque. Just nothing. And that nothing is loud. You walk by it and feel like you've interrupted a ghost mid-sentence. Because grief, when it doesn't get a funeral, finds other ways to stay. Entire villages vanished. Not to war. Not to fire. Just hunger. And when there's no one left to tell the story, the land keeps it for them. In Ireland, lichen isn't just a plant. It's memory. Fog isn't just weather. It's grief with no face. The trees that grew near old cabins? They weren't planted. They sprouted from where someone dropped a seed while dying. And the paths that lead nowhere? They used to lead home. Now they lead to a silence that creaks under your boots. But don't expect statues. There are no giant memorials. No towering monuments of sorrow. Just rocks. Just hills. Just wind. Because that's what happens when the poor die en masse. They're not remembered. They're absorbed. And the church, oh bless them, they kept records. When they could. Which was rarely. So instead of names, we got numbers. Instead of stories, we got deceased, age unknown. 1 million people died. Another million fled. But the landscape still pretends nothing happened. Like a body that learned to smile with a broken ribcage. And every year, tourists flock to the green. Take selfies on cliffs. Buy shamrock keychains. Drink beer dyed the color of envy. They don't see the famine. It's not in the gift shops. But for those who do know. For the descendants of the disappeared. Ireland isn't just beautiful. It's haunted. Because every rolling hill is a mass grave with excellent landscaping. Every stone fence is a question no one answered. Every ruined house is a lullaby that got cut off mid-note. Grief turned into geography. Absence turned into architecture. And the silence? It's not empty. It's full. Of names nobody says out loud anymore. But the land remembers. Always. Trauma is funny. Not in the ha-ha way. More like in the surprise. It's still here after 150 years way. Because the Great Famine didn't end when the last blighted potato turned to mush. It didn't end when the workhouses emptied or when the coffin ships docked. It lingered. Like smoke in a coat. Like debt in a name. Ask any Irish grandmother. Food waste? A sin. Portion control? Suspicious. Starving quietly? A generational skill. Because when a country survives mass starvation, It doesn't walk away unchanged. It limps. And it passes that limp down like an heirloom. The famine became folklore. Then politics. Then posture. Irish identity twisted into something part pride, part pain, part don't ask too many questions about that corner of history. And then there's the relationship with Britain. Oh yes, that's the gift that keeps on burning. Centuries of colonization, land theft, language suppression, and then famine. And after that, let's all move on, they said. Which is rich, considering how few of them ever moved in the first place. Imagine burning down someone's house, then asking why they're still cold 100 years later. Now imagine charging them rent for the ashes. That was the vibe. Even today, the famine still shows up in arguments. In literature, in politics, in pubs, halfway through a pint, when someone says, well, you know why we drink, right? Because trauma doesn't wear a top hat and walk into your living room. It creeps into lullabies. It sharpens the way you raise your children. It tightens around your gut every time someone says, at least you have food on the table. The famine planted a seed, not of potatoes, of resentment, of caution, of not trusting governments with food policy ever again. And that seed grew. Into rebellion, into migration, into an entire diaspora wired for survival and skeptical of help. And now, generations later, it's still there. Not always loud, but always present. In the way Irish people speak of suffering, with humor so dark it could qualify as coal. In the way history books tiptoe around the word genocide. In the way a whole people learned to make celebration out of scarcity and memory out of mourning. Because when your ancestors were starved into silence, you don't just inherit the hunger. You inherit the need to never be forgotten. Even if that means turning pain into poetry, or sarcasm, or storytelling. Especially storytelling. Because some scars don't fade. They just become culture. In the end, it wasn't the potatoes. It wasn't the blight. It wasn't the weather. It was the system, the shrug, the silence. And yet, the Irish endured. Not because they were built for suffering, but because they weren't given any other option. They danced anyway, not to celebrate, but to remember what celebration used to feel like. They laughed, not because it was funny, but because crying had become a luxury. They turned famine into fire. Not the kind that burns cities, but the kind that cooks stories. Because when the body can't digest bread, it learns to digest memory. And that's what they passed down. Not wealth, not land, but stories told with clenched teeth and a raised eyebrow. Legends of empty plates and full hearts. Of soup made from hope and boiled water. Of resistance disguised as rhythm. In songs, in sarcasm, in survival. Because maybe the real inheritance isn't trauma. It's the refusal to let trauma be the final word. They weren't just victims. They were narrators. And they told the world, you may take our crops, but not our voice. And that voice, cracked, tired, witty as hell, still echoes in every diaspora pub, every quiet Irish kitchen, every child named after someone who once chewed grass to stay alive. So what remains? The land, the wounds, the ghost villages dressed in ivy, but also the music, the language, the stories, and the humor. Oh, the humor, the kind that laughs at death, because death showed up early and often, and overstayed its welcome. And yet, here we are. You, me, listening, remembering, not letting it go quietly, because maybe the point was never about the potato, or even the famine. Maybe it was about what grows after, not from the soil, but from the silence. And that's what the Irish mastered, turning silence into seed, and planting something no empire could ever harvest. Legacy. So now, as the screen begins to fade, and your room grows still, let this story linger, not as tragedy, but as a warning, as a whisper, because history doesn't end, it echoes. And sometimes, it echoes through empty plates and voices that refuse to starve in silence. If this story sat with you tonight, even for a moment, then let it stay, not just as memory, but as heartbeat, as breath. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, and may your dreams be full, even when history wasn't. Good night.